Russian President Vladimir Putin has ordered a mobilization of the country's reserve army, a move that appears to suggest his war in Ukraine is not going to plan after 7 months of fighting. Mr. Putin gave an address to the nation in which he directly challenged the West's support for Ukraine and repeated his threat to use nuclear weapons. The reaction from European leaders has largely been dismissive. More proof, they say, that the Russian leader is panicking as he loses ground.
It is Russia's first military mobilization since World War II. 300,000 troops will be called up, far more than the initial Ukraine invasion force of 190,000, all in the name of Russian sovereignty.
Для защиты нашей Родины, ее суверенитета и территориальной целостности, для обеспечения безопасности нашего народа и людей на освобожденных территориях, считаю необходимым поддержать предложение Министерства обороны и Генерального штаба о проведении в Российской Федерации частичной мобилизации.
The mandate will apply to reservists with previous military experience, will not include students or those who only served as conscripts, and those involved will be given additional training before being deployed to the front lines. President Putin said the process of gathering soldiers begins immediately. He also vowed to use all available means to protect Russian territory, in what appears to be a veiled reference to Moscow's nuclear capability.
Граждане России могут быть уверены, территориальная целостность нашей Родины, наша независимость и свобода будут обеспечены. Подчеркну это еще раз. Всеми имеющимися у нас средствами. А те, кто пытаются шантажировать нас ядерным оружием, должны знать, что роза ветров может развернуться и в их сторону.
President Putin's announcement comes as Ukrainian forces embark on a major counter-offensive to take back territory in the northeast. They already regained control of villages in Luhansk and are planning to push further. Analysts believe the Kremlin is running out of reserves on the front lines. Russia's defense chief, Sergei Shoigu, says around 5,400 Russians have been killed. That's the first official death toll Moscow has published since March. Back then, it only claimed to have lost 1,300 soldiers. Ukraine, on the other hand, insists more than 55,000 Russian troops have died in the war so far. This week, Russian-occupied regions in eastern and southern Ukraine are expected to hold referendums to become part of Russia. Votes in Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson and Zaporizhia are all but certain to go Moscow's way. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and other foreign leaders have criticized the ballots as a sham.
And Stuart Smith joins us live from Moscow. Stuart, how is this call-up of the reserve army? So it's a partial mobilization and not a full mobilization. How is this going to be received by the Russian people?
Well, consider that for months now there's been an opportunity for anyone invested in the so-called special military operation to join to fight with very good pay, but either as a mercenary for various mercenary organizations or as part of the Russian military. So the low-hanging fruit in terms of people that want to fight seem to have been exhausted. What this does is make people fight, and the 300,000, although the Kremlin insists, will be made up of those that have military experience and the necessary skills to make a significant contribution. That could simply mean those that have undertaken at least a year of mandatory military service, as all fighting-age men in Russia must have done at some point in their lives. And so this will not necessarily be soldiers that are particularly experienced. The Russian president said that they will need to be trained up. And so there is a lot of sense in Russia that although this is not something that's imminently going to happen, i.e. the Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister, has hinted that this will be a process that takes days or weeks or even months to get close to that 300,000 figure. In the meantime, there is a lot of movement in Russia with people trying to flee the country. So airlines report that flights to countries that do not require a visa for Russian citizens are fully booked on Wednesday. They are incredibly expensive for the rest of the week, thousands of US dollars equivalent worth, and reports of land borders and crossings, say for example from Russia to Georgia, preventing Russian citizens leaving the country, i.e. there are many in Russia that do want to leave in case they are selected.
Stuart, back to that reserve army, that 300,000 strong force, you talk about it making a significant contribution. But how would you assess the difference that they might make on the ground in Ukraine?
Well, this is something that military analysts have been thinking about for a while. Would mobilization make any difference to Russia's campaign? Russia doesn't just suffer from a lack of people, it seems, is also struggling with the military equipment that it has and its ability to rebuff equipment supplied by NATO to Ukraine. And so a lot more has to happen, military analysts say, than just deploy more people. Consider also that these people would need time to integrate into any existing command structures, would need to be trained with the latest equipment and latest tactics of the Russian military. And people are talking here in Russia about there only being a change to how Russia's achievements are going in terms of months rather than weeks or days. It's going to be a longer process. Another problem, and the Russian President Vladimir Putin addressed this earlier, was the need for more manufacturing capability. Factories have been put on notice that they must deliver weapons and equipment as fast as they can, but also the government has been demanded by the Russian president to provide all the necessary military funding. So money, parts and people seem to be the main way Russia hopes to change the outcome in Ukraine, but also, again, as has happened before, the Russian president threatening nuclear weapons strikes if none of that is successful.
Thanks for that. Stuart Smith reporting live just there from Moscow.
Well, from the response in Russia to elsewhere, Russia's escalation could be sending shivers through the United Nations General Assembly underway in New York. Let's go to our correspondent, Will Denslow, for more. Will, first, how have G7 leaders responded to President Putin's announcement that he is, of course, upping the ante in the Russian war with Ukraine?
Well, Jill, we can very much expect this to be a prominent topic of discussion for G7 leaders and for their foreign ministers here in New York this week. And we can really expect to get a glimpse of how they're feeling when, at a ministerial level, the UN Security Council will be holding a meeting on Thursday to discuss the latest developments in Ukraine. So we'll get a very clear sense then from foreign secretaries from the G7 and the rest of the Security Council about exactly their response to these developments. Now, we haven't heard anything directly from the White House in response to President Putin's remarks and these developments out of Moscow, but we're expecting in a few hours' time to hear directly from US President Joe Biden when he addresses the UN General Assembly. So all eyes will very much be on what his response will be. Of course, it's already been suggested from the Secretary of State Antony Blinken that this will, of course, feature prominently, as will President Biden's promises to deliver more food assistance to the world. Of course, food insecurity is such a huge theme at this year's UN General Assembly. And, of course, there's also the matter of President Volodymyr Zelensky addressing the UN General Assembly via remote here in New York today as well. So that will be of huge interest to the rest of the international community.
Indeed. And also yesterday we talked about inequality and the climate crisis being among the issues that would take front and center among leaders, including Asian leaders. Have those emerged as main highlights, and what's expected later today?
Well, we heard from Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, who said that simply the world needed to restore back to a rules-based order, saying that the Russian invasion of Ukraine had shaken the UN Security Council's credibility. He also said that any attempts to change the status quo of territories by force would be unforgivable. Some analysts saying that's a veiled accusation at China and their policies in the South China Sea. Now, we also heard from President Yoon Suk-yeol of South Korea as well. Now, he said that technology needed to be front and centre, especially when it comes to green technology, more done to bridge the digital divide. Also stressing that South Korea will be hosting a meeting in Seoul later this year when it comes to pandemic and infectious diseases responses around the world. as well. Now, I mentioned, of course, the headlines for the meetings here in New York on Wednesday. Of course, President Biden and President Zelensky will certainly be taking up most of their headlines. We're also expecting to hear from President Raisi of Iran as well. Very interested to see his thoughts on the stalled JCPOA Iran nuclear talks too. We're also expecting to hear the first address at the UN General Assembly for Liz Truss, the British Prime Minister, since she took over at 10 Downing Street.
Much appreciated, Will. Will Denslow reporting live from New York.